So it's my pleasure to introduce Peter Calthorpe. I've known Peter for more than almost 50 years. And I'm hoping that a page will emerge that shows Peter's extraordinary innovation over the last 30 years. And in my introduction, I just want to point out that Peter's innovation actually is much longer than 30 years. In fact, he wrote this wonderful article as part of the passive solar movement. It was called the Solar Shadow, where he showed that a energy efficient solar powered suburban house used much more energy and consumed carbon way more than a poorly insulated townhouse in the city. And that launched his amazing work in the area of sustainable communities and cities. And you can see that in this extraordinary list of publications over the last 30 years. So Peter's going to summarize his thinking as a result of all of this work in the next presentation. So Peter, take it away.
Thank you. Am I online here? And should I start to share? Let me see if I can share. Little technology here. All right, I will try to summarize 50 years of thinking. And the thinking started way back in the 60s, as Harrison pointed out, and it just continues to evolve and build on itself. For me, a quote by Churchill kind of summarizes it all. He said, "We shape buildings, thereafter they shape us." And I always thought that applied more to cities than to buildings, although the crossover and the interaction between buildings and cities is clear. It's what Ed makes abundantly clear in his comments. But cities are the framework for our buildings. They're the framework actually for our lives. And they have run amok, just like many modern buildings did, in terms of how they relate to the environment and how they allow us to relate to each other. So my most recent work is this thing called Ending Global Sprawl, a modest undertaking that looks at cities around the world and sees how they can be made better. Now, the good news is that 3 billion people that Ed talked about moving to cities is a force for good. It's a force for their good. Cities are where innovation happens. It's where women get closer to equality. It's where education and literacy thrives. It's where poverty goes to die, especially for the rural poor. It's where growth happens for underdeveloped countries. And of course, we know that it's the low carbon alternative in terms of how we live on this planet. It's also the place where our greatest challenges become manifest, whether it's homeless and housing or segregation and racism. All the things that are on the line in the news today are really urban phenomena. How we live is really at stake when we shape the physical environment. And in a way, I think this is an important attribute of cities. It's not just about solving environmental problems or even something as important as climate change. It is intrinsically a set of what I would call co-benefits. If you get cities right, you solve many problems simultaneously. Cities are nested. They combine all the things you see on the screen here. And actually, you can't move ahead with any one without influencing the other. And quite frankly, in terms of politics, you can't get anywhere without satisfying many of them. And they do cluster. And we can conceive of whole systems approaches to how we shape cities. So when we solve for carbon emissions, we also not only deal with buildings, but transportation, land consumption, infrastructure. All of it comes together in the way we shape our communities. And that's, I think, that's what I'm going to try to outline today. On the one hand, everybody would be clear-headed about the fact that every city is unique, every culture, every history, every ecology. And yet, tragically, there are common flaws across the planet. And I think they come in three varieties. One is low-income sprawl. They're all sprawl, whether it's the poor being pushed to the periphery of the city and being marginalized in terms of their economic activity, and of course, forcing them into long commutes and huge environmental tragedies. To the more complex high-density sprawl, which they've been building in China and Asia, where even though density exists, the true qualities of a great urban place, its human scale and walkability, its mixed use, its ability to connect people in positive ways are all compromised. To what we think of as sprawl, our particular version, which we often call low density, but I call high income. Only high income communities can afford to live, as in the picture shown here. This is a manifestation of the kind of wealth that really can't be sustained because it's environmentally destructive, but also socially destructive. The isolation of different age groups, income groups, races, uses, it's all about isolation. So I'm going to go through examples of just two of these here, the high income and the low income. High density sprawl will be dealt with in the Asian version of all this. Well, we think of cities as individual entities, but of course we now live in metropolitan regions, and within regions, there are profoundly different places and lifestyles that shape our behavior environmentally, socially, and economically in different ways. San Ramon in Bay Area is classic sprawl. So isolated shopping, big office parks, subdivisions, nothing happens without a car. The old streetcar suburbs have a kind of an American integrity that provided for walking and human scale and mixed use, and actually at quite a low density, and are quite a viable urban form. And then of course our cities, San Francisco in this case is a very low density city, about half the density of Paris, and yet it still can function. So I think that environmental and social success in cities is not related to density. But these three different places, we can now measure the impacts. And in terms of carbon emissions, there's a 3.5 times difference between living out in the suburbs in San Ramon than living in San Francisco. And there's also a huge difference in land consumption, the amount of driving people do, the amount of walking they're possible. It's what I call the co-benefits. When you build cities that are coherent, you create solutions to many problems simultaneously. We looked using a sophisticated tool at growth for the whole state of California and looked at if it continued with trends or if it went to more sustainable growth. Urban footprint, the tool not unlike a lot of the ones architects use to do structural or energy analysis on buildings, but we can now analyze cities to a degree of detail that's astounding. We know every piece of the city. We know all the data around all these different environments, and we can look into the future and analyze the impacts, just like architects do when they look at different fenestrations and their impacts on energy. So we have the right tools to be able to do this. And this is I'll show you a fairly large use of this. Scenario planning. We look at how different versions of the future can have different outcomes. And we hypothesized one for California. Business as usual, 70% sprawl, standard sprawl. But the alternative wasn't so much everything goes to the city, which is the stereotype. The alternative was growing smart, which was 55% of that compact mixed use, kind of reinventing the streetcar suburb. And the differences are astounding. This is before we get to renewables, before we get to energy efficient buildings. Just the nature of that environment reduces our fossil fuel dependence. This is actually, Harrison, what I wrote about way back in the beginning with the solar shadow. Let's think big, not just building by building. But the co-benefits are equally astounding. And every co-benefit is the foundation for a political coalition. I don't think we win on climate change alone. We win on better cities and better lifestyles and more equitable societies. So when you save this much land, you save habitat, you save agriculture, you save the environment in a big way. Look at LA under business as usual in 50 years versus under compact. It doesn't look possible, but actually at this moment in history, it's viable and actually economically necessary. People can't afford to live in sprawl anymore. We discovered that in '08. The vehicle miles traveled before we get to the energy source for those vehicles comes down dramatically. And it's related to place. Here's a mapping of VMT across LA. And the red areas, the peripheral areas, are where people drive the most, 3 times as much in many cases as more urban areas. The differences are already present. We just need to highlight them. Building energy goes down before we get to any codes or Title 24, just by the nature of the building. That townhouse with its party walls, more efficient than that single family dwelling with solar collectors. We have health impacts. Of course, all the driving and carbon emissions affects us respiratory, and now we have analytics on heart disease and walking. Here's a mapping of the walking that goes on in the LA region. And the darker blue colors are where people walk a lot. And of course, they correspond to places where it's safe to walk and destinations are close by. It's not rocket science. Infrastructure cost goes down. And so the development community and the fiscal impacts on cities are impacted. But perhaps most importantly, the cost per household, the crisis of middle-class affordability rides on us finding a lifestyle that isn't so expensive to the environment, expensive to our pocketbooks. And we're able to actually document through travel behavior and home energy and water consumption, tremendous amount of savings, nearly $10,000 of savings per household in the future in real today's dollars, on an average income of 50. This is a huge benefit. So affordability comes into the equation. And yet we haven't really solved the problem yet, just like with climate change. So we have had a tremendous housing debt, and it's driving the cost of housing through the ceiling. We haven't replaced the old paradigm that if you can't afford a house close to your work, you just drive another 10 miles to a cheaper subdivision in a more remote location. And so housing affordability in California is only 50%. What's the answer? I began working on that, thinking the specifics. What are the specific answers? It turns out with Amazon, the strip, our commercial zones, the arterial network we built around the automobile since World War II is all moribund. It's underutilized land. It's in every one of our communities. It's where we could infill and redevelop and build another set of environmental places that make turn environments that look like this into environments that look like this. You may say, well, that's far-fetched. It's actually not. The marketplace, most developers now are seeking out infill locations for higher density housing because that's where people want to live, close to destinations and jobs, and where they can afford to live. But we can also enhance it to a level that we've never known before, with great urban places, biking, walking, and new forms of transit. Oops, wrong direction. So let's look at it in reality. This is LA. mapping out its arterials and its transit systems, expanding. With Footprint, we can actually go in and identify every parcel of land that sits on an arterial that has a gray parking lot and a single-story building. Anything with an FAR of 0.5 or less and 2/10 of an acre or larger. These are all places that we could be building new housing that's embedded in the heart of our cities and close to the economic opportunities that people need. So we have close to 20,000 acres in LA County alone. This could build at a range of densities up to 1.6 million units of housing. We don't need to sprawl. We need to convert the strip. And the environmental consequences of doing this are, once again, across the board, a lot of co-benefits: energy, water, VMT, which isn't just carbon and energy, it's also congestion and air quality, carbon emissions, and of course, household costs. Everything gets better when we do this kind of urban massive repair. We did the same analysis for the Bay Area. There's Silicon Valley, Camino Real running down through the middle of it, and discovered that we had up to 1.4 million units of housing in the heart of Silicon Valley on 15,000 acres of land. So green fields, ag land, suburban freeway interchanges, these are no longer the armature for growth in this situation. We have 400 miles of high capacity transit possible on these arterials. The beauty is you're building housing where you can expand transit service. The two go hand in hand. And once again, Urban Footprints gives us the analysis. Greenhouse gases down by 50% for a household that lives on one of these grand boulevards as opposed to sits alone in a subdivision on a cul-de-sac. So hand in hand with this idea of infill and urbanism, we need a new form of transit to enhance and make life better for this kind of infill. We have the corridors, the roads are wide enough. What can we put there? Now, there's a new generation. A lot of people are very excited by autonomy. But the problem with a private car autonomous is it generates more miles, about a third more. If you share it, it's even worse because, of course, there's the deadhead. There's all the miles driven, taking people, getting back and repositioning. And of course, you can be up to double the amount of vehicle miles if you go in a taxi. So that's not going to solve the solution, solve the problem. We know that bus rapid transit on dedicated lanes is the most cost-effective form of transit throughout the world. It started in South America and now is a big part of transit in China and most of the developing world. And we're beginning to experiment with it. But I think, as a matter of fact, here in China, they have autonomous rapid transit buses. All you do is paint a line on the street and it follows it. In Singapore, they're experimenting with smaller vans on autonomous lanes. This is El Camino. This is a typical strip America. It's about 150 feet. What can you do with that? It turns out you can build broad sidewalks, tree canopies, bike lanes, and transit lanes, all unfortunately without giving up too much of the automobile lanes. So there's room for all. We were so extreme in how we laid these things out. One form, of course, is BRT, and it's most cost effective. But another form that I see coming is autonomous vans. Because they run in dedicated lanes, they act more efficiently, and you can cluster origins and destinations, and basically everybody goes direct. It's faster, cheaper, and of course, in terms of operating expenses, a whole nother world from our traditional light rail and heavy rail. I do think there's a new generation of transit coming, and it's going to be hand in hand with a new generation of urbanism. All right, low-income sprawl. I have a few examples here in Mexico and in, I don't know how much time I've got left here. and in Ho Chi Minh City as examples. In Mexico, they have social housing, subsidized way at the periphery because it's cheap land. That's above. And then they have informal housing. The informal housing is more interesting, self-built, and actually, I think, is a bigger systemic solution for affordable housing around the planet. Give people sites and services, roads and utilities, and a starter box, and let them build their own place. And make sure it's in transit-served areas that have healthy ecological systems surrounding and jobs nearby. Mexico City is in gridlock. Any of you visited there understand this. But the people who really pay for this are the low-income population who live at the periphery. So look at the way Mexico City is shaped. The wealthy live downtown in the cultural, historic, and economically robust areas, and the poor people live to the periphery. The jobs are all concentrated downtown. We didn't, in much of the world, did not follow our pattern of redistributing jobs to the suburban office park and industrial zones. And so the concentration of economic opportunity and wealth is synonymous and, of course, really detrimental to the people. We mapped out accessibility. The best area, of course, is where there's mixed use and walkability and transit. That represents just about 26% of the population. You have areas where you have transit, but no walkability. It's a tragedy. You have areas, very small areas, where you have walkability, but no transit. But the vast majority, 2/3, are development areas without transit, without walkability, without nearby jobs. Fixing that has to do with this scenario planning. So just like, I won't go into great detail here, you design a building and you experiment with different ways of shaping it and you measure the consequences of that, we could do the same. And the variables here are the land, consumption, where employment's located, what kind of transport investments are there, and what kind of urban configurations are assumed.
Peter, you have about 8 minutes left.
Not a problem there. So this kind of matrix of multiple co-benefits, whether it's land consumption or travel time for low-income populations, you know, in many parts of Mexico, we are at about 3-hour commutes across multiple bus systems. Water consumption, energy consumption, all these things can be measured. The beauty of a map like this is that it is the foundation of political coalitions. So all the people who are advocating for preserving land or water conservation or affordable housing, they can see that one solution serves all. In Ho Chi Minh City, we begin work by looking most fundamentally at how the city is sprawled into floodplain. This is truly should I say, beachhead of climate change. This is an area where now over 400 square kilometers of development sits in floodplain, and it is still growing as per the city's master plan. So a new master plan has to be evolved that actually completely transforms how and where sometimes becomes the most important question, where growth should happen. This resettlement of people above the floodplain and at least deflecting the next generation of growth is and should be the highest priority for urban design here. We actually have identified 4 sites that are on high ground where if infrastructure and transit is expanded, development can shift away from the south and its floodplain into safe and resilient areas. This is a radical shift, but it's a shift that has to take place. As we do that, we can also develop cities that are truly environmentally and socially benign. You know, it's interesting. I go around the world and I look at mobility as how do people get around and what's the environmental and social consequence? They tried BRT in Vietnam. Nobody wanted to get on hot, crowded buses. Everybody wanted to stay on their motorcycle. So Robert Severo and I started thinking about, well, what if you turned all the motorcycles electric and you turned them into a form of mass transit? The problem now is that by mixing modalities, cars, motorcycles, and buses, nobody moves effectively. If we provide dedicated lanes to electric motorcycles, the question was, well, how much capacity do you have? It turns out, if you do the numbers, and you start with a cyclist at 14,000 trips per peak hour on a one lane of traffic, but you increase it because of 1.5, 2 people riding on a motorcycle, and you increase the speed. Turns out that the capacity of a lane is 32,000, which is more than light rail or normal BRT. It sits somewhere below metro, which is important, but it's a completely ecological and culturally appropriate form of mass transit. People go where they want, they're out in the fresh air, and you have the same lane capacity. In fact, building a lane of light rail for maybe 120 million could be cut to building a lane for electric bikes to maybe 4 or 5 million. It's an affordable solution. So there's all sorts of different strategies. The nexus between the social life we weave in cities and the environmental impacts and the economic future, of course, is apparent in all cases. I'm not going to show high density sprawl, but I will end with these 8 principles. It's not as if we don't know how to do the right thing. And the right thing has universal characteristics. First is you start with preservation of ecosystems, of agrarian landscapes, of cultural heritage sites. You greenline them and you create urban growth boundaries. The second is you always create mixed use environments. You create places where people can walk, in which everyday activities are close at hand. The third is you create a street network that allows easy connectivity, a tight human scale street network. You need public space at reasonable ratios, which we can identify and actually put numbers to. Walking and biking becomes preeminent in how you shape a city. And if you don't, it doesn't become an option. Enhancing transit is what happens when you create great urban places. People will tend to use transit if you can make it affordable and ubiquitous. And ubiquitous is the most important aspect. And finally, transit-oriented development, whether it's linear, as I'm beginning to think through in terms of the Grand Boulevard strategy, or nodal, it's become an accepted concept globally. So those are easy principles to remember in terms of how we shape cities. And as we shape cities, we of course build political and economic coalitions and social coalitions. So it's all a win-win-win. I think that's all I have today. And I will not go into China at this point. I don't think I have time. So Harrison, are there any questions? Do you want to have a discussion? Do we have time for any discussion?
Peter, thank you so much for a great presentation. It really outlines steps at the city and regional scale, outlining all the co-benefits of doing really good urbanism. I have to ask the staff, we have questions that you could pose to Peter.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions, and then we'll leave 8 or so minutes for a quick break. We had one question come in from Michael. In post-pandemic America, if work shifts to home and we live anywhere and we do not have to commute, will middle density still be the new norm?
Yes, the idea of work from home, I think, will be a partial solution. People need social interaction. They need to actually be together. And so I think that there'll be an interesting blend. It makes the neighborhood an even more important place, not just some place you drive to and isolate in your backyard, but actually a place in which you socialize and get to everyday activities and cafes and environments that you share. On top of that is the environmental imperative. Maybe the super wealthy can isolate on a hilltop on many acres, but the reality today is a lot of people live in a service economy where they still have to go to work, and they don't have abundant budgets. And so the inherent frugality of great urban places, the richness of urban places that you don't have to pay for, the shared parks as opposed to the private yards, and the shared mobility instead of the private cars. These are all things that play a big role in a growing majority of the new middle class, which intrinsically across the globe is less wealthy than we experienced here in America in the last 40 years. So no,
Yeah,
I
I
don't
think
think fundamental change.
it also really emphasizes the importance of public space at medium densities, that these have to be really livable, mixed use, memorable places.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. We have another question?
Yep, I think we have time for one more. So we got a question from Carolina. Does Urban Footprint also provide city information for Mexico?
No, not right now, but it will, unfortunately. The database collection is really quite a huge undertaking. Right now, Footprint has every parcel of land across the whole United States. It's a huge database. They will be expanding into other countries soon, however.
Okay, great.
Well, maybe it's time to thank Peter again for a great presentation. Who would have known that a solar shadow would cast over 50 years?
Thank you, Harrison. I'll take off now. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you both. We will be taking a really short 10-minute break. We will be back on at the 30-minute mark for our next session, which is Reset, Practice, and Policy. It'll remain on the same Zoom webinar, so we will see you shortly. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.